Formula One teams are made up of so much more than just their drivers. In fact, teams can have anywhere from just a couple hundred employees all the way to over 1,000. And today we're going to be talking about how many people it really takes to put a Formula One car on track weekend after weekend. Welcome back to Grid Chat. I'm your host, Marissa Tandon, and right now we are in the middle of something called Grid Chat University. Whether you just started watching Formula One last season, or maybe you just found Formula One through Drive to Survive or a particularly well-edited thirst trap on TikTok, or maybe you've been watching Formula One for a while now and just felt like you didn't have anywhere that you could ask questions. This is that place. The idea behind the series is that while we are on this Formula One break, we're going to use the time to actually go through all of the basics of the sport. Obviously, we won't cover every little nuance, but by the time March rolls around and the season starts, if you listen to these episodes, you should be able to understand the sport from a very basic point of view, with enough of the details that you can answer questions when people ask you about them, and hopefully some of the questions that you haven't felt like you could ask are answered throughout this series. Last episode, we went over the very basics of a race weekend. We talked about the two different championships, the point system, the different events that happen on a race weekend, and how a regular Grand Prix weekend differs from a sprint race weekend. So if you missed that episode and you want to get into those basic facts, you can just go back to the episode before this one wherever you are listening to the podcast. But today we're going to be talking about sort of the unsung heroes of this sport. When we talk about Formula One, the drivers absolutely get the most attention. And that makes sense, as they're very much the ones that we're watching on television. Drivers are the face of the team, and they are the ones that during a race weekend are absolutely responsible for getting us across the finish line. However, getting that car on track requires a lot of other people that we don't talk a lot about. So today I want to talk about some of those other positions in Formula One. These jobs are some of the coolest jobs that you can have. And just because we don't hear about them on the broadcast every weekend doesn't mean they aren't critical to making this sport work. One of the reasons Formula One is so interesting to watch is because it is one of the most high-stakes engineering problems that you can try to solve. Like I said, every team is a little bit different, and some teams that have a higher budget are going to have many more employees, which means that not every team functions exactly the same way. So as we go through these positions today, I'm going to basically give you a general disclaimer that this is just a general explanation of how Formula One teams are put together. Some teams like Red Bull may have way more positions than I talk about today, whereas some teams further down the grid with less funding may find that positions Red Bull has actually have to get put into kind of hybrid positions where one person is doing multiple jobs. So while everything does not happen the same at every team, there are some general basics that we can go through so that you understand how this team comes together. Now, first and foremost, one thing you should know is that not everybody follows the team around the world as they're driving. There are whole parts of a Formula One team that actually never leave the factory. For this episode, we're actually going to talk about them first, because I feel like we talk about them the very least when it comes to actual broadcast. The team at the factory is actually responsible for some of the most important parts of the car, and that is developing the car before it ever sees the track. The factory team houses the design team, the aerodynamics team, and the simulator team. The design team at the factory is full of really intelligent engineers, and their job is to take all of the data that they have from the previous seasons, plus the little things that their competitors did better than them, and all of the rules and regulations that the FIA sets for the cars, and bring all of that together to try to design the best possible car from concept all the way through build. This team is the one putting pen to paper and saying, this is what the car should look like, these are the different things that we could try to make the car faster, and they're looking at things like what types of materials we're going to use, how durable the car is, how the car performs in the wind tunnel. All of those very tiny and important details in building that first version of the car take place as part of that factory team. One of the other things that happens at the factory is the simulation team. Now, you may have heard drivers refer to racing in the sim or testing things out in the sim, maybe even something along the lines of how much time they've spent in the sim, and you may have also heard drivers reference the fact that their reserve drivers are helping out in the sim. Basically, sim is short for simulation. And the team at the factory can take all of the information that they have about the car, things that the design team and the engineers want to try out, and they can put all of that data into what's called a sim. At that point, they can then run the car and the proposed changes through pretty much any scenario. So if the engineers have this idea that they think would work really well for the Mexico City track, they can put that data into the sim, and then a driver can sit in the sim and run that data and give feedback. Think about it as a very advanced version of when you play F125 at home, or if you've ever been in a simulator at one of the Williams fan zones or something like that. Those sims allow the team to test all of these different options before the car ever gets on track. And then during the actual race season, you also have a team that's actually responsible for rebuilding the cars whenever they come back from different races. Those cars are actually shipped back to the factory from time to time. There are parts that have been damaged that are removed. There's a team that has to look and say this part can be salvaged, this part can't. And then that same team is looking at how they can rebuild the car back at the factory. This is a very simplified version of what happens at the factory. And if you ever pay attention to Formula One team social media, you'll often see clips of the drivers going back to the factory and talking to very large teams. A huge amount of making this Formula One car possible, it takes place at this stage, with teams that you may see once or twice a year on social media. This is the team that you're hearing referred to when drivers are saying things like, "Thank you so much to all the guys back at the factory," or when you hear a driver say that the guys at the factory really had to work to bring a car back up to speed after a particularly bad crash or a particularly bad weekend. So while this team is not present at the racetrack, Formula One cars would not make it on track if it weren't for the people at the factory. Again, this is a super simplified version. Not every team does it the same way, so it's hard to go through every single possible job that you would have. But it's also important to remember that there are a number of other teams that have nothing to do with the actual technical engineering of the car. Things like marketing, business development, HR, jobs that you would expect to see at any other type of business. Formula One teams are in their own right mini businesses. Some of them are smaller, some of them are really big, but in addition to all of the engineering jobs that you would think of as specialized, there are a lot of specialized people that are working in jobs that might feel a little bit more familiar to you. And again, those teams may be bigger, they may be smaller. Some teams might have multiple aerodynamics sub-teams, whereas others may have smaller teams that accomplish the same goals. But no matter what, the factory is a large portion of making a Formula One team run. So what about the team that's actually at the track? The guys that you're seeing in helmets and jumpsuits while you're watching the Formula One race. Let's run through a couple of key positions that travel with the team. First, obviously, you have two drivers. Those drivers, I would assume you're pretty familiar with what they do. Their job is cargo fast and do not crash car. Sometimes they crash car. So let's talk about some of the other people that you may or may not be familiar with. First up, you have your mechanics. These are people that you're probably used to seeing on television. They're the ones that are in the garage ready at any moment to fix the car or run a pit stop, and they are responsible for making sure that the car itself is safe to drive. They're fixing things that go wrong. They're fixing things that break on the car. They're making sure that the car is ready to go before we actually start the race or a different session. And they're also the guys that you're typically used to seeing when it comes to a pit stop. This team has to be incredibly fast on their feet and incredibly precise. And if anything goes wrong in a pit stop, for example, it can and has cost drivers the race. So this team is a team that has to work very hard to make sure that they're doing everything exactly right. If you watched my YouTube video back in July when I was at the Silverstone race with Red Bull Racing, you can actually see how cool it was to watch these guys at work. I got a chance to actually watch them do pit stop practice. Plus, I also got to watch them work on the cars before a new session. If you want to see that footage, you should go to that video because you can see exactly how hard mechanics actually have to practice to get everything exactly right. It's not only timing, but making sure that they are precise, because sending a car out with a loose wheel or a part that you needed to replace that you didn't replace properly could not only end in you losing the race, but could actually be very dangerous for your driver and the other drivers competing. So mechanics are probably the most physical job on a Formula One team other than the actual driver themselves, and also one of the teams that requires the most precision. Now, separate from the mechanics, we have the engineers. These are also some of the faces that you're used to seeing when you watch an F1 race inside the garage. Again, every team does this differently, but here are a few of the different types of engineers that you may see on a Formula One team. There are aerodynamic engineers, and they are responsible for, you guessed it, the aerodynamics of the car. And these guys are actually a bridge back to that factory team. They're going to transmit some of the data that we get on track back to the factory team, who can then take that information, make sure everything is going to plan, or help figure out some adjustments that might need to be made between free practice sessions and the race itself. Engine engineers, which is a little bit of a mouthful, are responsible for the actual power unit, and they have to make sure that they work within the safety and the confines of the actual Formula One kind of restrictions when it comes to the power unit. You also have performance engineers. They're responsible for everything that has to do with the chassis of the vehicle, and they're going to work on those settings and the different things that they can do to tweak the performance of that car. And of course, you have strategy engineers. Now, one of the things that I think is important to know about strategy engineers is that when we talk about them, sometimes we only think about the strategy that they're running for their specific team. But one of the things that they are also responsible for is managing the strategy of other teams. Obviously not making those strategy decisions, but staying aware of the decisions those teams are making on track and how they compare to their own strategy and how they may need to change things. So this is the team that's helping look at things like an undercut or determining whether or not their driver is about to be undercut by another team's strategy. They're looking at things like when competitors are going in for pit stops, tire strategy that other teams are running, and how it compares to their own strategy. Because again, you can plan as much as you want to before you get to a race, but nothing is set in stone until those cars are actually on track, and you won't know what the other teams are doing until you start to monitor it in race. So strategy engineers are kind of one of my favorite positions on this engineering team because they're really responsible for so much data, but also big game time decisions. They're the ones that are in charge of all of those different lettered strategies that you're hearing Ferrari call out over the radio. They're the ones that work to help come up with different game plans. If Lando pits now, how much of a gap do we have to be able to catch him? Those little things are constantly being adjusted by those strategy engineers. When it comes to the mechanics, there is one person in charge of all of them, and that is the chief mechanic. Their job is to make sure that everybody on the mechanic side of the team is on the same same page, and they're that final call for the mechanic side of things, making sure that every mechanic that is at the track working on these cars is doing exactly what needs to be done to maintain their current strategy. That chief mechanic is making sure that the car is safe and that the car is running at the exact specifications that every other part of the team has agreed upon. Now, similarly to a chief mechanic, we also have a technical director. That is on the engineering side of things. A technical director is very much responsible for the engineering team. They're making sure that every one of those engineers that I mentioned are actually following what they need to do. They're maintaining that strategy, and they're making sure that everything on the engineering side is running according to plan. Now, one thing to remember is that every Formula One team has two sides of their garage, as they have two drivers. Each driver has their own mechanics, their own engineers, and then the technical director and the chief mechanic are in charge of both sides. Additionally, you also have a data scientist. Their job is to make sure that they are maintaining all of that data that comes in across a race weekend, cross-referencing all of that data with the team and also sending it back to the factory and helping make those decisions that might need to be analyzed by all of that data that we get from free practice sessions and qualifying. Now, the last part that I want to talk about is the team that you're seeing sit at the pit wall. And every team may do this differently, so there might be different combinations of the people I'm about to talk about. And the pit wall is that group of people that you're seeing sit in front of a bunch of screens right next to the track. The people that you most likely will see there could be the team principal. Now, these are people that you're pretty typically used to seeing, people like Toto Wolff or Fred Vassar. They're pretty much the big boss. They're in charge of really running and managing the team and delegating everything that needs to be done to different people. You'll see team principals in press conferences, and sometimes you will see them on the pit wall. Though sometimes you'll also see team principals actually stay inside the garage. Toto Wolff, for example, the Mercedes team principal, has some of those iconic moments where we have seen him throw things, shout, and bang his headset, and that happens inside the garage, not on the pit wall. So again, not a requirement that your team principal is sitting on the pit wall, but you also probably have seen people like Christian Horner, who is the Red Bull team principal, or Andrea Stella, who is the McLaren team principal, or Fred Vassar, the Ferrari team principal. You've seen all of them sitting on the pit wall and being involved throughout the race there. This is also where you may see some of the race strategy team. The head of race strategy may sit on the pit wall, as well as the driver's race engineers. Now, race engineers are pretty important figures when it comes to Formula One. Each driver has their own race engineer, and when you're listening on the radio throughout the race, that is typically the voice that you're hearing. Their job is to take all of the information from the team, understanding the strategy and the different things that they need to do, and also be that direct point of contact to the driver. A lot of people wonder who that person is on the radio, and why not everybody is typically talking on the radio. But think about it, it would be pretty stressful at over 200 miles an hour if you were trying to discern over a radio connection who was actually speaking to you. And if you were trying to guess between all of these different people that I told you about today, who was trying to give you information and who to remember to ask what questions. So that's why most of the time you're only going to hear two voices over the radio to a driver. That's their race engineer and maybe their team principal. The race engineer's job is not only to help the driver stay on track, but also to take direct information from the driver and communicate it to the team. While the rest of the team can hear the team radio, and so they can hear the driver speaking over the radio and the messages that they're sending, they're not going to be the ones to send back messages. They're going to communicate that through the race engineer. So again, these are people that you're used to hearing. And one of the really exciting things that actually came out during this break is that we are actually going to get our very first female race engineer in the history of Formula One. Her name is Laura Mueller, and she will be a race engineer for Esteban Ocon over at Haas. Some of the most iconic pairs in Formula One come from a race engineer and a driver pairing. These teams can be together for seasons at a time, and there are probably some pairs that you really recognize, like Max Verstappen and GP, and very tragically broken up this year, Lewis Hamilton and Bono. Now, the one other thing I did want to point out for people that are maybe coming from the Drive to Survive or maybe just the media aspect of things, the team principal and the CEO are two completely different positions. However, that can be a little confusing because sometimes the team principal is also the CEO. That's a situation like Toto Wolff at Mercedes. And other times the CEO is super present. An example of that is someone like Zach Brown at McLaren, who people often forget is actually the CEO and not the team principal. Then you have other people who are very clearly delineated as the CEO, but still kind of a public-facing figure like Lawrence Stroll over at Aston Martin. But it is important to remember that these are two completely different positions, and the team principal is actually the one who's running the team on a day-to-day basis, whereas the CEO is in charge of the company as a whole. Now again, every team does things differently, so things that you may have heard me talk about today are just really the general positions that you would see at a Formula One team. Some teams have more funding and they're going to have a lot of really specific positions available. Some teams have less and they're not going to have a ton of availability for big specific positions. And some teams just like to do things their own way. So everything that we covered today are general positions that most likely you would see on any Formula One team. These are the ones that are pretty critical and that you may hear referenced throughout a Formula One race, and also a little bit of a glimpse as to what needs to be done to actually make a Formula One car go fast. If you have any questions about today's episode, any questions about previous episodes, or questions about Formula One in general, you can send those in. There are a number of different ways that you can do that. If you're watching the podcast on YouTube, you can leave your question in the comment section down below. If you're listening to the podcast somewhere else, you can go to the YouTube version and actually leave your question as a comment there. And also also remember that on my YouTube channel, I'm giving you more additional content that's outside of the podcast that's really visual and a little bit more expansive than what I do on short form. And speaking of short form, you can also send in your questions if you go to find me on TikTok, Instagram, or Threads. All of those are at Marissa Kumari. You can send me a question there, or you can also join our Discord server, and the link to do that is in the episode description down below. So far, I hope you are enjoying Grid Chat University, and I look forward to seeing you next week when class will be back in session.